Today and Across the Fence, we'll mark two key events in American history. We'll travel to Gettysburg for the beginning of the most famous battle of the Civil War, and we'll learn how a 2-minute speech given at the site of the fighting inspires admiration and awe even today. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. 150 years ago today, fighting began in and around a small college town in southern Pennsylvania. When the Battle of Gettysburg ended 2 days later, there would be some 50,000 casualties. Gettysburg marks the northernmost point the Confederate Army reached during the war and is considered the turning point in the war between the states. Over the next 3 days, we're going to take an in-depth look at the battle and the important role Vermont soldiers had in its outcome. Our guides are Civil War historian Howard Coffin and photographer and Across the Fence associate producer Keith Silva. Here's Howard with how and why the Battle of Gettysburg began.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1863. A town of about 2,500 people. A college town, a farming town. For the first 3 days of July, it becomes the scene of the biggest battle in the history of America. Much of the first day's fighting took place on these fields behind me, to the west of Gettysburg. The Confederates under A.P. Hill came in from the west along the Chambersburg Pike. They were met by John Buford's cavalry and then supported by the troops of the First Corps under John Reynolds, forming a battle line north and south through these fields. Fighting goes on through most of the day, and more Confederates arrive. James Longstreet's troops coming up, Baldy Ewell's. The Union is outnumbered, and the 11th Corps breaks. And they withdraw through town to the high ground east of Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, where they dig in as the first day at Gettysburg ends, and these fields are filled with the dead and wounded. The first day at Gettysburg is a Confederate victory. The Union Army withdraws to the high ground west of town, right here to Cemetery Hill, where they dug these entrenchments to protect their cannon. South of us along Cemetery Ridge, coming here at the orders of Oliver Otis Howard, who was in command late the first day, a man who spent the last years of his life in Burlington. And at night, Winfield Scott Hancock arrives with orders from General Meade to take command here at Gettysburg. Howard reluctantly gives up command. The stage is set now for the second day at Gettysburg. And as the day ends, the 2nd Vermont Brigade ends its 120-mile march from Virginia, exhausted, tired, but ready for the next day's fighting, though never having fought in any kind of a major battle.
Well, Howard joins us now in the studio. Always great to see you.
Nice to see you, Judy.
After the first day the Confederacy is winning the battle at Gettysburg, was the Union Army prepared for such a large-scale conflict?
The Union Army was very well prepared. They had lost a big battle 2 months earlier at Chancellorsville, but it wasn't the soldiers' fault. It was the commander's fault. And these were tough, veteran soldiers, combat experienced. The Army of the Potomac, the big Union Army, was never better prepared, but they didn't expect the battle to start at Gettysburg, and when it began, only 2,500 soldiers there.
Okay. So do historians know who fired the first shot?
Absolutely. We do. It was a man named Marcellus Jones. He was with the 8th Illinois Cavalry. They were way out on picket west of Gettysburg in the early morning of the 1st of July, and in the distance they see Confederates coming through the morning mists. Jones takes a rifle, puts it on a fence rail, blam, he fires the first shot, misses, but that begins the Battle of Gettysburg, the first of over 1 million shots. Jones had been born in West Paulet, Vermont, grown up there, and had gone west to Illinois and signed up there when the war began. So a Vermonter fired the first shot, and he put a monument on that spot years later.
Awesome. Well, today is the first of our three-part series about the Battle of Gettysburg. In your opinion, Howard, what has had a greater impact on America, the battle or Lincoln's Gettysburg Address?
Well, you have to say the battle had the greatest impact because it was the turning point, really, of the Civil War. Lincoln anticipated this question, really, in the speech. He said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." So he was saying that the actions were more important. But Lincoln's words, so powerful and so important to the times and to all time, that they live on as our memory of the battle.
Which is so important because obviously this is a huge event in our history.
It might be the most important event in our history, and it rededicates the country to the original purpose that all men are created equal. That's what Lincoln is saying, and he says it so well.
All right, well, I want to remind our viewers that today is the first of 3 programs on the Battle of Gettysburg. Tomorrow we learn how Vermonters helped in the defeat of Pickett's charge. And on Wednesday, we'll take a behind-the-scenes look at how this series was put together. For now, we're going back to Gettysburg to learn about the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg and how it became the backdrop for one of the most famous speeches in American history.
The Battle of Gettysburg produced more than 50,000 casualties. The houses, the churches, all the buildings in Gettysburg seemed to be filled with them. To care for the wounded, the Union Army brought Major Henry James, an experienced surgeon, to oversee their care, and he came from Waterbury, Vermont. But what to do with the dead? The dead were everywhere. They lay on the slope of Little Round Top, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had launched his bayonet charge to save the Union line on the second day. They were all over Plum Run Valley, which suddenly gained the name the Valley of Death. They were in Devil's Den among the boulders and the rocks. They were all over the wheat field, where long lines of battle had stood at almost point-blank range on a hot July afternoon and slaughtered each other. The dead were everywhere. The Confederates were hastily buried in mass graves, but what about the Union soldiers? They were placed in individual graves, and most of their graves were marked with rude headboards. But what to do overall? The Gettysburg people addressed the problem. They formed a committee and they decided to create a national cemetery, and they wanted to put it on Cemetery Hill. It was approved, and a plan was made to dedicate the cemetery on the 19th of November, 1863. And to highlight the thing, they decided to invite to Gettysburg the most influential, famous orator in all of America, Edward Everett of Massachusetts, former president of Harvard and governor of the state. And then, as an afterthought, they decided it would be nice to have a few appropriate remarks from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's staff at the White House wanted him to come to Gettysburg by train the morning of the event. But Lincoln said no, he'd go the day before on the 18th. He wanted to be sure he got here. The rails were going to be busy with special trains going to Gettysburg. This was a big event. Why was Lincoln so eager to be here? He didn't want to miss it because he had some things he wanted to say to the country. The war was not going well. Yes, there had been a victory of sorts at Gettysburg, but Lee's army had not been destroyed. Lee was back in Virginia on the loose. Lincoln knew the war would go into the next year. There was so much fighting and bloodshed ahead. There were some things he wanted to say. So he got here at 5 o'clock on the afternoon before the event. He was met here by David Wills, the Gettysburg lawyer, who was the moving force behind the cemetery. and Wells escorted him just up the street to the square where Wills's house stood, where Lincoln would spend the night. The day of the great event, Lincoln came in a procession from the Wills house out to the cemetery, to the speaking platform, which was located at the top of the hill, up beyond that fence. The cemetery was still under construction. There were open graves, and they were keeping the crowds out. And what a crowd there was, probably 20,000 people, including many men who had fought here. Edward Everett spoke first, and he spoke for 2 hours, as he was expected to do, and he gave a magnificent report on what the battle had been all about, and he was careful to mention Stannard's Vermonters. A hush came over the crowd after the long applause for Everett, and then Lincoln walked to the speaker's stand with a few small papers in his hand. He looked out across the valley where all of this had happened, and he began to speak. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The applause for Lincoln went on and on. And then the 20,000 people went away, but really they have never stopped coming to Gettysburg, which has become the shrine of the American Civil War.
Well, Howard, those words still give you chills today listening to them.
It's a remarkable piece of writing. The economy of words, so much is said in that address. Edward Everett, you know, messaged Lincoln afterwards and said, "You said more in 2 minutes than I said in 2 hours." It's all there, and Lincoln knew he was speaking down the years, telling America that America must be about free people and equal opportunity, but people. That's what we've got to be about. We might listen again today and again and again.
Exactly. Well, Howard, thanks so much for joining us and for all the work that you do to keep history alive here. It's really a wonderful thing. And we just want to remind our viewers that we're going to have much more from Howard and from Keith Silva over the next couple of days right here on Across the Fence. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX TV.